For 25 years, the youngest son of Queen Elizabeth II said almost nothing. While his brothers made the headlines, Charles and Diana, Andrew and Epstein, divorces and leaked tapes, and interviews that tore the monarchy apart, Edward stayed quiet. He went to work. He raised his children. He carried his father's charity. The tabloids lost interest. The public forgot he was there. And over time, a certain consensus settled in. There was nothing to say about Edward because there was nothing going on. They were wrong. In the autumn of 2025, a British newspaper finally forced open a set of documents the Crown Estate had kept sealed for more than 2 decades. Parliament started asking questions. The press expected another Andrew, another story of royal privilege buried under redactions, another embarrassment. Instead, they found something they did not know how to describe. A man who, starting in 1999, had been quietly preparing for this exact day. Every signature, every payment, every market valuation logged with the National Audit Office, registered with Land Registry, backed by his mother, his father, and his sister. This is the story of how the tenant nobody noticed became the only royal whose arrangements might actually survive the reckoning of the decade. It is also the story of a tiara that was never just a tiara, a word a daughter-in-law said out loud in front of the Queen, and a sister-in-law who, for the first time in her life, stopped keeping her distance. It starts with a conversation nobody recorded. A few days before Edward's wedding in June 1999, his father pulled him aside. Philip rarely stepped into matters of titles ahead of the Queen, but on this, he was clear. He wanted Edward, eventually, to inherit his own dukedom, Duke of Edinburgh, the title Philip had carried since the day he married Princess Elizabeth in 1947. By every tradition, that title should have gone to Andrew. Edward was 7th in line to the throne. He was the youngest son. Nobody had been grooming him for anything. But Philip chose him. The Queen agreed. And on the day of the wedding, Buckingham Palace issued the quietest possible statement. When Philip's dukedom eventually reverted to the crown, it would be re-granted to Edward. No signatures, no legal instrument, just a public promise, with the weight of the monarchy behind it. For 22 years, that promise sat there, waiting. Philip died in April 2021. Elizabeth died in September 2022. On the 10th of March 2023, on Edward's 59th birthday, Charles made the announcement. The Dukedom of Edinburgh would go to his brother. But there was one line most headlines skipped over. The title would be held by Edward for his lifetime only. That word, lifetime, meant something specific. It meant that when Edward dies, the dukedom returns to the crown. It does not pass to his son James. It does not continue down his branch of the family. It ends. Officially, this preserved Charles's option to grant the title to one of his own grandchildren someday. Legally, that is true. But anyone reading carefully understood what it actually said. The title Philip meant as a legacy had been converted into a personal honour, a life tenancy, a ribbon to be worn and then returned, which made the other half of what Elizabeth had arranged for Edward suddenly much more important. Because a Dukedom of Edinburgh by itself is symbolic. It does not come with land or income or a seat. Everything material about that title rests on one building, Bagshot Park, a 120-room Tudor Gothic mansion on 51 acres in Surrey, 11 miles south of Windsor. Built in 1879 for Queen Victoria's third son, Grade 2 listed, and in 1996, a liability. The Royal Army Chaplains Department had lived in it for 50 years. When they moved out, the Crown Estate was left with a building that was worn, outdated, and generating nothing. They considered 2 commercial proposals, a hotel conversion, a conference centre. Both were rejected. And then, in March 1998, they offered it to Edward. The terms? A 50-year lease, £5,000 a year. That number, £5,000, is the one that appears in every headline critical of Edward's arrangement. It looks indefensible. It looks like exactly the kind of royal handout the public has been taught to recognise. But the number is meaningless without the rest of the contract, because the lease had a condition. The tenant had to restore the building, fully. The National Audit Office later documented the final figures. Total restoration cost £2,980,000. The Crown Estate paid roughly £1.5 million. The remaining £1,360,000 Edward paid out of his own pocket. Money he had earned before becoming a full-time working royal, mostly from his television production company. Once restored, the rent was recalculated. It rose from £5,000 a year to £90,000. The National Audit Office described that figure, in its own words, as market value. This is the detail nobody was prepared for in 2025. Because up to 2007, Edward was paying the full market rate on his home. His brother, Andrew, at Royal Lodge, was not. When the Public Accounts Committee started digging through royal leases in October 2025, this was the contrast that emerged first. Andrew took occupation of Royal Lodge in 2003 under an arrangement similar in structure to Edward's: large upfront payment, renovation obligations. But his annual rent was a peppercorn, a symbolic £1. For more than 20 years, Andrew has effectively lived in a 30-room Windsor mansion for free. Edward, during the same period, was paying £90,000 a year. 2 brothers, 2 royal houses, 2 contracts signed within a few years of each other. One paid, the other did not. Then, in 2007, Edward made a move that passed almost unnoticed at the time. Through a company called Eclipse Nominees Limited, he paid the Crown Estate a single upfront sum of £5 million. In exchange, his 50-year lease was extended to 150. The annual rent after that payment dropped to a peppercorn. On paper, this looks like the same arrangement Andrew had. In reality, it is almost its opposite. Edward had paid, up front, something close to the cumulative value of the rent he would otherwise have owed. He had converted a long-term rental obligation into long-term tenure. His contract gave him the right to assign the lease and keep the proceeds. Bagshot Park is currently valued at around £30 million. Edward, at 62, has a home his family can use until the year 2014-80. This is what 25 years of quiet planning looks like. When the Times used the Freedom of Information Act in late 2025 to force the unsealing of his lease, a document the Crown Estate had always released only in heavily redacted form, the expectation was scandal. And what they found was audits, the market assessments, the signatures, and dated payment records. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden. Just a paper trail so complete it became its own defence. But Bagshot Park was not the only thing Elizabeth arranged for the woman her son was about to marry. On the 19th of June, 1999, Sophie Rhys-Jones walked up the aisle at St George's Chapel in a dress threaded with pearls and crystal. And on her head sat a tiara jewellery historians would later come to call the Anthemion Tiara. The palace said almost nothing officially, only one sentence. It was taken from the Queen's private collection, altered by the Crown jeweller. The rest had to be pieced together. The conclusion that has become standard: 4 antique elements at the heart of the tiara, anthemions, an ancient Greek decorative motif shaped like stylized honeysuckle, originally belonged to Queen Victoria's regal circlet made by Garrard in 1853. The circlet itself was dismantled in the 1930s. The empty frame sits today in the Museum of London. But those 4 Anthemions, pieces Victoria had rarely worn in her life, ended up in Elizabeth II's private collection. She gave them to her daughter-in-law. And there was something else in that gift almost nobody noticed. The word Anthemion is ancient Greek. Philip was born a prince of Greece and Denmark. The tiara was simultaneously a gift from the Queen and a quiet acknowledgement of her husband. The pearl necklace and earrings Sophie wore that same day came from a different hand entirely. Edward had designed them himself, working with royal jewellers in the months before the wedding, creating a piece calibrated to the exact height and angles of the Anthemions on her head. And then came the word. In October 2019, in a reception hall at Buckingham Palace, Sophie stood at a lectern to give a speech celebrating the work of the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Trust. The speech had been prepared in advance, cleared, published on the royal family website. But somewhere in the middle of it, one word appeared that Sophie had never used publicly in 20 years. Mama. She said it from a podium across a room of senior royals. She said it to her mother-in-law directly. Mama, when I have returned from my travels, I have been so proud to share with you the work I have witnessed. It was one word. It was in a script, and it was still, for the people in that room, one of the most extraordinary things anyone had heard anyone say about Elizabeth II in public. Because everyone knew what it meant. Sophie's mother had died of cancer in August 2005. Her granddaughter Louise was not yet 2. Her grandson James had not yet been born. Sophie rarely spoke publicly about that loss. When she did, once, she said this: "To this day, I miss her very much. There are moments when I hear music she loved, or do something I know she'd have wanted to hear about, and her early departure makes it very hard." Elizabeth II knew this about Sophie, and in the years that followed, the bond between them changed shape. Former aides described it in almost identical language, like mother and daughter. In September 2022, at Balmoral, when the Queen's life was ending, the list of people allowed near her was very short. Sophie's name was on it. 4 days later, in Edinburgh on the 11th of September, her coffin arrived at the Palace of Holyrood House at the end of a 6-hour journey from Balmoral. Anne, the Queen's only daughter, who had travelled beside the hearse the entire way, stood at the gate. The cameras caught her face as the coffin passed. Sophie stood beside her and placed her hand on Anne's back. That gesture meant more than the cameras understood, because Anne, for most of her adult life, had kept Sophie at a distance. Anne does not perform warmth she does not feel. This has been true about her since childhood. If she is not close to you, she will not look close to you. For more than 2 decades in the family, Sophie and Anne were polite, cordial, fundamentally separate. Something changed in April 2021, when Philip died. Anne and Sophie, the 2 women who had been closest to him in different ways, began to see each other almost every day. They stayed near Elizabeth through her last year. They went riding together. They started appearing at engagements as a pair. And then, on that day in September, the hand on Anne's back became the image of it. Since then, through Charles's accession, through the Andrew crisis, through the parliamentary inquiry itself, the quiet alliance of Anne, Edward and Sophie has remained one of the most stable things in the institution, which matters, because the 2020s have been a decade in which public gifts have started looking a lot less permanent than the people who received them assumed. In 1981, the Queen Mother gave Diana Spencer a necklace with an emerald pendant dating to 1863. Technically always Crown property, but passed down with every sign of being a personal gift. Diana wore it in Vienna, in Toronto. After her death in 1997, it returned to the royal collection. In March 2019, at a reception marking the 50th anniversary of Charles's investiture as Prince of Wales, Camilla appeared wearing a brooch. At its centre was the emerald from Diana's necklace, redesigned. The palace explained, correctly, that the piece had always been Crown property. Formally, that was true. Emotionally, it changed nothing. Because what the episode made clear was this: the line between a personal gift and a dynastic asset is not fixed. It can be redrawn. Pieces that feel like they belong to one person can be reclassified in another era. The word of a monarch who has died cannot necessarily be defended by the people who loved her, which is why the documentation has come to matter so much more than anyone would have predicted 20 years ago. Elizabeth II made Sophie a Dame Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order in 2010, the monarch's personal award, given for direct service to the sovereign. She gave her the Royal Family Order in 2004. She gave her the Anthemion Tiara in 1999. She gave her Bagshot Park. All documented, all dated, all registered. On the 29th of October 2025, the chair of the Public Accounts Committee wrote formally to the Crown Estate. He wanted numbers on Royal Lodge. On the 2nd of December, the committee announced a full inquiry. Subject: Crown Estate leases with royal family members. Scope: Royal Lodge, Forest Lodge, where William and Catherine had moved in July 2025 on a 20-year market-rate lease, Bagshot Park, and others. Evidence sessions to begin in 2026. In the news cycle that followed, Bagshot Park and Royal Lodge appeared together. The coverage made them look like the same story. But when investigators opened the two files side by side, they saw something else. One was a scandal. The other was a 25-year paper trail of payments, audits, valuations, and signatures. Every transaction on record, every figure verifiable. The people who came looking for another Andrew found, instead, a man who had understood a very long time ago that someone someday was going to ask him to explain everything, and who had written the explanation out in advance. This does not mean the pressure ends. The inquiry continues. The broader question underneath it, how much of what the royal family has they should still have in the 21st century, is not going to be resolved by one set of audited lease terms. But what Edward has, and what almost nobody else in that family has in the same concentrated form, is the thing paper gives you when memory fails. Proof. Proof of what his parents intended. Philip's stated wish from 1999. Elizabeth's personal decorations bestowed across 20 years. The tiara she chose from her own collection. The lease her Crown Estate signed with her own son at market rate. Charles has the crown. Camilla has the apartments at Buckingham Palace. William and Catherine have Forest Lodge and the heir apparency. Edward has a life peerage that will not pass to his son, a Surrey mansion on a lease that runs until 2148, a wife whom the late Queen treated as a second daughter, and a sister who, for the first time in her adult life, stands beside him in public without being asked. He does not have a throne. He was never going to. He is 15th in line now, dropping further with every new royal child. But he has something quieter, which in the long run may matter more. He has the receipts. James, his son, will not inherit the Dukedom of Edinburgh. That was decided in 2023. But James will inherit something else, an understanding of how the institution actually works beneath the ceremony. That every gift in this family holds only as long as the signature behind it holds. That the quiet son, the one who never made headlines, who paid his own way, who documented everything, that son, in the end, will be one of the few who steps out of this era of reckoning with his home, his name, and his family untouched. Philip, standing with his son a few days before that wedding in 1999, was not imagining a world in which all of this would have to be proved. In 1999, the monarchy was still operating under different assumptions. A word from the Queen, a wish from the Duke, a handshake, these things were expected to hold. They no longer do. But Edward, it seems, understood that a long time ago. And while no one was watching, while his brothers made the noise and the public looked elsewhere, he did the only thing that was ever going to matter. He wrote it all down.